I tell you, we have been, this is the third week in Genesis, in the story of Joseph. And the first week was dealing with Joseph the dreamer. And last week was Joseph prisoner. And this week is Joseph the ruler. But it's really taken a little bit of a different angle on it. Really, the main focus of this is the fact that Joseph never changed. Joseph was consistent. Regardless of his circumstances, Joseph was faithful to God, and Joseph continued to live his life with integrity. Much of that was outlined last week in dealing with Potiphar's wife and the circumstances around his being accused. And I just briefly want to highlight one verse out of chapter 39 of Genesis. One single verse. And this was when the opportunity, when the temptation came to be. And that's in verse 9. This was his response. "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" When I read that the first time a few weeks ago, first time in preparation for today, this really sets up Joseph as a ruler. Because in the opportunity, when he had worked his way up through and had great power and had great influence and had great authority over Pharaoh's house, he was in charge, and to a lot of ways, he was in a position where he could have done anything he wanted to have done, and he could have allowed that to kind of get to a place where he thought he could do anything that he wanted to do. But he remained humble, and he remained understanding that it is the Lord who had blessed him and helped him get into this position, and that he remained faithful to the Lord. My father-in-law often has this phrase that he uses. I'm sure he got it when he was growing up, and it was instilled in him from his father. He and my father-in-law and his brothers, they played a lot of sports, and it's one of those things where he would always say this, particularly when we're watching a sports game, or we're watching over the course of time. In baseball, a lot of times this happens where someone will come in and they'll be really good for the beginning month because they haven't been figured out, or in football, if a new quarterback comes in and you don't have a scouting report on him, and he can do things, and then leagues adjust to them. So it's commonly in sports, but it's also something that we talk about in ministry a lot. And it's this phrase that, he went and got the big head. What he says. Meaning that he enjoyed the success that he was feeling in that moment and allowed it to go to his head. And suddenly, phrase that I heard a lot in my childhood, he was too big for his britches. Or don't know how he's going to fit through that doorway with his big head as he's got. Joseph didn't allow that to happen in his life. I mean, this is the same Joseph who got sold into slavery. Sold into slavery by his brothers. And he ends up working his way up and having all kinds of power and influence. And the second thing that struck me about this is thinking about it in my own house. What if I switch this up a little bit and I'm reading it from the perspective of there's no one greater in this house, in my house, than me. And that God put me there. And in the context of my own personal sin, and in the context of my own personal behavior, and in the context of my own personal life, that when temptation rises up, how is it that I respond to that? I think oftentimes when we hear stories, particularly Old Testament stories, not that the New Testament is all that more familiar to us from a sense of like our world, But I feel like there's this thing as we get closer to the beginning of the Bible that we feel a further disconnect. Joseph's life is a real life model of our lives. We all can agree with, we all can have a connection to, we all understand and go through periods of times where things just keep happening and it's not our fault, and things that just keep coming at us and we feel overwhelmed at times, and at times it can be difficult to make the right decision. But guess what? Joseph did. And I submit to you, his integrity should be a model of integrity for us. Now, integrity, we talked with the kids earlier today about doing the right thing to do, and regardless of circumstance, and that's true. But I submit to you a little bit of a wrinkle to integrity, about what integrity is, or maybe a different definition of integrity than we think of on a regular basis. So what if we consider integrity as this? Integrity is when we come to make a decision that we consider the weight of the consequence of that decision. Meaning that we could have the same decision, you and I, and we could come up with a different answer as to what that means in our life, whether we do it or we don't do it. Maybe I do it and you don't, or you and I don't. But that the integrity piece is that both you considered all the consequences of your decision, and that I considered all the consequences of my decision. How often in our day-to-day lives do we just do things just because? Maybe it's the pattern. Maybe it's what society expects from us. Maybe it's what our job expects from us. Maybe it's what we perceive to be what they expect from us. But do we really think about? Do we really weigh out the consequences of our speech in front of our non-Christian friends? The way that we talk to our spouse in front of our children? Do we weigh the consequence of how we speak negatively about another church or another Christian? Do we think about the consequences that exist of decisions that we make? Joseph understood that in his position, it wasn't just a sin in that moment, but it was a sin to go against where God had placed him, the position of authority that God had placed him in. Now, I want to take us down just a small bunny trail. We're veering off for just a little bit. Doesn't go with the sermon, but I had to say this, a little sidebar here. Let's be clear on this, because I feel like maybe we're not so clear on this in our Christian world and when we talk in Christian discourse. Temptation is not of God. God does not tempt us. God does not tempt us to sin. It's not from God. Temptation is from the enemy. Lies are from the enemy. God wants to destroy the lies of the enemy in our life. Sometimes we get so caught up in this temptation mindset that, oh, we're tempted, so now I've sinned, and so now everything's done. It's all for naught. Just a few weeks ago, Pastor Mike showed an incredible video of Jesus being tempted. Jesus was without sin. Jesus was tempted. Temptation is not sin. Temptation is not from God. When we are tempted, the Lord is right there, and He will provide a way out every single time. Maybe that way is humbling. Maybe that way will end you up in prison, like Joseph. But but God will provide a way out. It's in his nature to be faithful to us. All right, back on course now. Joseph understood the weight of his decision. Today we had the kids kind of model a very brief decision-making tool, decision process, one that didn't have eternal consequences. One bag had rocks in it, the other didn't, that's all. Isn't it amazing how God has designed periods in our life where children, the main focus for a child is to learn. That's what a child is to do, is to learn. The main focus of their life. That doesn't mean that they don't get to enjoy life. It doesn't mean that they can't experience life or go through different things. But the purpose of a child's early life, of our life as children, is that we are learning. And when we get to be teenagers, the purpose changes a little bit. It shifts a little bit. Not that we aren't lifelong learners. Not that we aren't still learning lessons every day. But in teenage years, it becomes about testing. Right, parents? Parents of teenagers? Testing boundaries. You know what? That's a healthy thing. They need to be able to understand and root into what they have been learning as children so that they can stand on their own as adults when life comes. That they know not only what they believe, but why they believe it, because they went through the testing process. Testing is important. Testing can be very testing on parents. Adults, we're to live. We have life. One of the things I think about often when we talk about development in life, it's easy to kind of change that over to development in a spiritual life. Because we don't all become Christians as children and then go through a natural progression of testing as teenage years of our spiritual life, and suddenly we're adults and we know how to live an adult life and an adult Christian life. Sometimes we become Christians as teenagers, or sometimes we become Christians as adults. And then when that happens, it gets a little tricky because we expect adults who are Christians to act like mature adult Christians. But in reality, maybe they're a baby Christian even though they are an adult. Maybe we have teenagers who've been Christians for a long time and have already started the process of testing and have become mature Christians even as teenagers. And then it gets the whole thing flipped on its head when you have a 19-year-old teenager who is a mature Christian and you have a 45-year-old teenager who's acting like a baby, or a 45-year-old adult who's acting like a baby. But guess what? That's life, and that's messy, and that's the life of the church. We don't all come in at the same place. But teenagers, even if they've matured in the faith sense, still don't have the perspective of an adult. Just this week, I was at a middle school here in Delaware County, speaking on the topic of poverty. It wasn't just me. They invited several people from the community to come and speak to different groups of kids. Mine happened to be 7th graders. And much of my 45 minutes of time talking to them ended up down a path of explaining to them what bills were. At one point, they asked, and this is a fair question. So it's like your rent, bills? Like, yes, rent is a bill. At that point, the teacher who was in the room started listing off all of her bills and explaining to these kids that, these things, there's so much more than when we just get up and then, oh, look, there's food in the refrigerator. And, oh, the magic laundry fairy did my laundry. And oh, my goodness, like, I have clean clothes and I have food. Oh, I have someplace warm to sleep or cool to sleep in the summer. I mean, it's amazing. Like, oh, Do we have to pay for the gas that goes into the vehicle that I'm getting transported around 900 times in a day? Those things that we just, teenagers, although they try their hardest, don't really have a comprehension until it happens. You know, there's a long-standing joke that, you know, I was lied to as a teenager about bills. My parents told me there were bills. They just never told me they were going to keep coming. Isn't that how it feels sometimes? I mean, that water bill or that electric bill or that mortgage payment, whatever it is, like, didn't we just pay this? Sometimes it's because we did just like a week before, but anyway. That's real life. Teenagers don't have the capacity. Teenagers don't have the capacity to be able to have an understanding of the weight of the consequences. Why do you think that we have so many big campaigns to try to reach to our kids and explain to them that they are not invincible? Because as a teenager, you feel invincible. Did you know that there's a certain point, sometimes for some kids it's like 13 or 14 years old, it's usually about 16, where they know everything about life. They've got it all figured out. Because they don't understand the consequences of their decisions. Integrity is about weighing out those consequences. Now, I would be remiss if I'm talking about age and child development and everything else if I didn't bring up Luke chapter 2, verse 52. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature in favor of both God and men. And it's a very great verse that's one of the longest verses in the Bible. 18 years. Jesus was 12. He was listening to those that were teaching in the temple. He got left there for 3 days. The caravan left without him. They came back. They found him. And they were all the teachers were amazed by some of the questions he was asking. But he was 12 years old. Then Luke 52 says that happened. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature in favor of both God and men. And boom, it's his ministry. And he's suddenly 30 years old. 18 years. Sometimes, now here I'm putting on my Pastor Ben hat and my opinion. Disclaimer, this is my opinion. There you go. Sometimes we expect too much out of our kids instead of allowing them to learn like God designed them to learn. Sometimes we expect our kids to be the ones modeling, witnessing to other kids. That they should be the ones who are leading our church in that way. No, our kids should see us witnessing to people. And guess what? They can join right in and we can train and give examples and be able to allow them to be praying for people. And that's great and encouraging, but the focus of a child should be learning. We shouldn't be dumping that on them. We as adults in the church are the ones who need to take responsibility for that. But instead, we act like teenagers who can't comprehend the weight of the consequences of our decisions. Our focus for our kids should be the same as it was for Jesus, who from age 12 to 18 was preparing for ministry. Growing in wisdom and stature. Learning. Let's not rob our children of their childhood because we're putting too much on their plate. Let's cut our teenagers some slack because they're still figuring out life. But let's us adults, let's get our act together. All right. Chew on that for a while. Back to Joseph. One of my favorite Bibles I got as a gift. I don't remember who it was that gave it to me. That's really important, I guess. But maybe I bought it for myself. Let's just pretend that that's the case. It's this one. It's not my normal preaching Bible. But it's a really good one, and I really like it. It's John Maxwell's Leadership Bible. And so all along there's stories of leadership and really like some different things of how it impacts. And he discusses Joseph particularly here. And then that was a really long way of saying that these are not my original thoughts. I'm really big on citing sources. It's just a big thing for me. It's a piece of integrity for me. So, there you go. He outlines 5 different points in Joseph's life where he faced adversity. And then he talks about how there was a comeback. You know, we love a good comeback story. Like right now, tonight in Game 4, when the Cavs are going to put it to the Pacers and then they're going to right the ship and win the series, we like a good comeback story. A couple years ago when they were down 3-1 to the best team in history, and yet they came back and won and dominated and are amazing. Okay, we like a good comeback story. That's what we like. Mostly because we can identify with that. We all face trials and we all face adversity in our life. And we see a good comeback. And the best part of this, and the best example that Joseph is to us, is that his comeback is all centered around God and being faithful to God and maintaining integrity. So, to rehash, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers after they kind of considered killing him and then talked themselves out of it, and there was a big plot to maybe save him from this. Didn't happen. Traders came. He got sold to slavery. But Joseph, he developed competence and he helped organize things. And so as a slave, he ended up getting promoted to being the head of Pharaoh's house. That was all made possible by God. God took this awful circumstance in his life, and because Joseph remained faithful to God, he was able to see the path that the Lord had for him. But then that wasn't enough adversity in his life. He then was framed and accused of being an adulterer, which he wasn't, and he remained faithful to this, to God through this. And he used his ability to discern dreams and solve problems in order to make his way out of the prison. Now, unfortunately, while he was there, he faced yet another adversity in which he got forgotten in prison, in which he had interpreted dreams for the baker and said, oh yeah, sure, I'll be sure to come back in. I won't forget you, except he did. And yet, he was able to display wisdom and interpret Pharaoh's dreams, which ended up getting him back out. Which then arrives to Joseph as a ruler, in which he is in charge of all of Egypt. And he sees that there's going to be a famine coming, and through, again, interpretation of dreams from the Lord's giving him that ability and that wisdom, he's able to prepare Egypt for the coming famine. Again, because he was faithful and depended on the Lord. Prepared to save the country and bring Pharaoh great wealth. He yet again faced adversity when he had to stand, or when his brothers, those treacherous brothers of them, stood in front of him and asked for help. And through a series of exchanges, he was faced with what decision to do. You know, those same brothers who thought he was dead, or assumed he was dead, and at least, at best, was still in slavery somewhere, had no clue or concept that that's who was standing before them as a ruler, as the head of Egypt. And yet Joseph kept his integrity in dealing with his brothers. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 41. We're going to read about 20 verses today. They'll go quick, no worries on that. Genesis chapter 41, starting in verse 37. I'll be reading out of the New King James Version, because that's what this particular Bible is, so there you go. Genesis chapter 41, verse 37 through 57. And this is the story of Joseph as ruler. And this is the time in which he had gotten to being in power. Verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man whom is the Spirit of God? I'm going to take a moment. Is there not a better compliment from a non-believer than them recognizing the power of the Lord living inside of you, and that is what carries your day? You might want to highlight that or star that or something and just say you know what? This is our goal. This is our mission. This is us living out our life. If we were living out our life, each and every one of us, to where non-Christians, non-believers recognize the power of God that is inside of us and they know something is a little bit different, that's when we're living out the kingdom. All right. 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and over all of my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off in his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee, so that he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him his wife Aniseth, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly, so he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and he laid up the food in the cities, and he laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, gathered as much grain as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. I'm going to skip down to no, not skipping. I'm sorry. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine came, from Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Born to him, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all of my father's house. In the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began. Joseph, just as Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he says you do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands. Joseph is the model of consistency. Joseph continued to weigh out the consequences of decisions, and he continued to remain faithful to God. The same Joseph that was the dreamer is the same Joseph that was the prisoner, is the same Joseph that's the ruler. And that's the point. When we are in trying times, when we don't know heads from tails, when we can't see beyond the storm, when we don't understand how this could possibly be happening to me, Till we get resolved out of that, and then we are a good place, but then things continue to happen, and something terrible happens, and it's not my fault. To even when times are good, and things are right, Joseph remains the same. Tell you what, that is difficult to be that consistent, and yet that is what we are called to do. Such a key and crucial part of holiness and living a holy life is remaining consistent in our integrity. If we're a different person on Monday than we are on Sunday, if we're a different person on Friday or Saturday, there's two main issues with that. Number one is it has consequences. People see that. People know that they can't count on you to be consistent. But people also see that. And what they see, that your faith isn't worth living. If you're not dedicated enough to live the same life Monday through Saturday as you are on Sunday morning in church and in the presence of other Christians, what part of that says to other people that you value your faith? Man, that's a hard word to hear. There's consequences to the way we talk to people. There's consequences to the way we treat people. There's consequences to the decisions that we make in our life. And we're called to weigh those consequences. We're called to consider them. We're called to integrity. And the best part about it, the best part of all of this, is that we know that God remains faithful. That no matter what the circumstances are, God is faithful. Why are we called to have integrity? Why are we called to be holy? Because that is who God is. God is integrity. God is holy. God is faithful. And just as He is, that's who we're called to be. I'm going to forego the remaining portion that starts in chapter 42 in the interactions with his brother. And we see how it all comes full circle from the very beginning of the dream that started this all. The dreams that he had that his brothers despised. They come to fruition and they come true. And it plays out. But what I want, the biggest point to be heard today is that integrity takes some effort. We have to work at it. We have to be willing to do the right thing when the right thing isn't the popular thing to do. We have to be willing to take a stand because the Lord tells us to take a stand, even if we don't really fully understand why we're taking that stand. But if the Lord says we need to take a stand on that, we should take a stand on it. When the Lord tells us to take a stand on something that's in here, and maybe it's not a popular thing to take a stand on in our world, we ought to remain faithful to His word. It's easy for us to go a different route. It's easy for us to be overcome by theologies that make it sound like, oh, we're just doing it wrong. Here's a quick, simple, easy fix, 100% guarantee, satisfaction. It's awesome. It's pleasing to hear those things. Oh, living a Christian life is easy. You're just going to have all kinds of money and perfect health and everything's going to be great. The Lord wants to richly bless us, The Lord will protect us, and He will bring us through any affliction that we have because He is faithful and that's who He is. But guess what? The world is not all rainbows and butterflies, rainbows and sunshine for Christians in our Christian walk. In fact, He tells us there will be trouble of many kinds, tribulations, trials. Why do you think that Paul spent so much time on explaining how to be holy and also just sharing practical examples of dealing with crud in our life and people in our life that seek to destroy us and allow themselves to be instruments of the enemy? Having integrity takes effort. Being a Christian takes effort. But God is faithful. God is absolute. God is not wishy-washy on morality. He's not situational on morality. God is faithful. And regardless of the circumstance of our life, He will remain as such to us. We're going to have Evelyn come back up here. She's going to share a song for us. It's going to close out our service. And hear these words of God's faithfulness.
Though time it seems like I'm coming undone, these walking often feel alright. No matter what, until this race is won, I will stand my ground where hope can be found. I will stand my ground where hope can be found. Oh, oh Lord, I know you hear my cry. Your love lifting me above all the lies. No matter what I face this unknown time, you'll take all that is wrong and make it right. You'll take all that is wrong and make it right. Whoa. Your strength is found at the end of my road. Your grace, it reaches to the hurting. Still through the tears and the questioning why, I will stand my ground where hope can be found. I will stand my ground where hope can be found. Oh, oh Lord, I know you hear my cry. Your love lifting me above all the lies. No matter what I face this unknown time, you'll take all that is wrong and make it right. You'll take all that is wrong and make it right. I will stand my ground. I will stand my ground. I will stand my ground where hope can be found. I will stand my ground where hope can be found. Oh Lord, I know you hear my cry. Your love lifting
Will you stand your ground where hope can be found? Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for that message of your faithfulness and the call for us to model like Joseph and have integrity to stand our ground. Lord, be with us as we go this week. May we see you at work in our lives. And may we seek out opportunities to share your love with others. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Go. Be blessed.